The first cache discovery log entry 1. Site designation, Black Fork Ridge, Allegheny Backcountry, elevation 2,200 feet. Camera unit 41, mounted to a red oak at the edge of a game trail nobody had walked in 14 months. The card comes back with 412 triggers. 411 of them are deer, raccoon, one bobcat, a possum dragging something across the frame at 3 in the morning. The 412th trigger is time-stamped 2:19 a.m., and it shows something standing upright at the very edge of the flash radius, facing away from the camera, motionless. For 11 consecutive frames before it simply isn't there anymore. That's where this story starts, not with a scream in the woods, not with a shape crossing a headlight beam. With a data set, 412 files on a memory card, that a field technician named Dana Reyes pulled out of a waterproof housing on a Tuesday morning in October, expecting nothing more interesting than the usual raccoon parade. Before we go further, if this is your first time on the channel, subscribe now. We bring you documented encounters every week, cases with names changed where necessary but facts that came from somewhere real, somebody's field notes, somebody's camera card, somebody's testimony given under the condition that we protect their identity. If you leave without subscribing, the algorithm probably won't put this in front of you again. The button's right there. Now let's get back to Black Fork Ridge. Dana Reyes is not her real name. She asked for that condition before agreeing to talk to us. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why a wildlife researcher with a graduate degree and a decade of camera trap experience would want her name nowhere near a story like this one. She worked for 6 years as a field technician for a regional conservation nonprofit that ran a black bear and bobcat monitoring program across a stretch of Appalachian backcountry that straddles the line between 2 states. A program funded partly through university grants and partly through state wildlife agency partnerships. The unglamorous kind of long-term ecological monitoring that produces spreadsheets nobody, outside a small circle of specialists, will ever read. Her job was straightforward on paper. Maintain 40-some camera units scattered across roughly 60 square miles of mixed hardwood forest, ridge country, and river bottom. Swap batteries. Swap memory cards. Log species, log behavior, log anything anomalous. Feed it all into a database that would eventually become somebody's dissertation chapter or somebody's grant renewal application. What Dana did not expect when she took the job in her late 20s, fresh off a master's program studying mesopredator release dynamics, was that 6 years in, she'd be sitting in her apartment at midnight with the lights on. Going through a folder of images, she'd renamed 9 separate times trying to find a file name that didn't feel like it was daring someone to laugh at her. We're going to tell this story the way Dana eventually organized it herself, not chronologically as it happened to her, season by season, but by case file. The way she started thinking about it, once she understood that what she was looking at wasn't one incident. It was a pattern spread across 4 years of camera data, and patterns, as Dana puts it, are the only language a field researcher really trusts. Anecdote is cheap. A pattern across 4 years and 40 cameras is not cheap. It costs something to build, and once you have it, it costs something to sit with it, because it doesn't go away just because nobody official wants to look at it. Case File 216. That's the internal designation Dana eventually gave to the incident at Black Fork Ridge, matching it to the format the program used for every other flagged sighting in the database. A habit she kept even after she stopped believing the database itself would ever hold what she was actually documenting. The date was an October Tuesday. Dana had hiked in that morning to service 4 units along a stretch of ridge that the program monitored specifically, because a bobcat with a distinctive notched ear had been photographed there twice. The previous winter, and the team wanted more data on her territory before the female likely denned for kittens the following spring. Servicing a camera trap is boring work, and Dana describes it that way without any embarrassment, because the boredom is the point. The whole discipline of camera trapping depends on collecting thousands of uneventful frames so that the rare eventful ones mean something statistically. She pulled the card from Unit 41, popped a fresh one in, checked the batteries, logged the GPS coordinates, and the time in her field notebook exactly the way she'd done hundreds of times before, and hiked out without any sense that this particular card was going to be different from any other. She didn't review the footage in the field. That wasn't standard practice. Cards got reviewed back at the small field office, the program rented in a converted farmhouse near the nearest town, on a desktop computer with a proper monitor. Usually in batches at the end of the week, when 3 or 4 technicians would sit around comparing notes on what they'd found. Dana loaded the Black Fork Ridge card that Thursday, 2 days later, alongside 6 other cards from that same sector, and started clicking through the way she always did, fast, practiced. Her eyes trained to recognize species almost instantly from partial frames, the flick of a tail, the shape of ears against firelight. 411 frames of exactly what you'd expect from a healthy piece of Appalachian forest in early autumn. Whitetail does moving through at dawn and dusk. A young buck, still in velvet, working the same trail 3 separate nights. Raccoons, of course, raccoons always, because raccoons trigger motion sensors more than any other species in the eastern forest, and every technician in the program has a private. Mostly affectionate contempt for raccoons as a result. One bobcat, not the notched-ear female they were tracking, but likely a transient male, moving through at 2 in the morning on a Saturday. A possum near the very end of the card, dragging what looked like a piece of carrion across the bottom of the frame at 3:14 a.m. And then 412th, the last triggered sequence on the card, time-stamped 2:19 a.m. On the Sunday between those 2 nights, a sequence that the camera's motion sensor had captured as 11 consecutive frames spaced roughly 2 seconds apart. The maximum burst length the unit was configured for. Dana describes what she saw the way a technician describes something, which is to say with more restraint than the moment probably deserved. In the first frame, there's a shape at the extreme right edge of the flash radius, at the limit of what the infrared illuminator could reach, maybe 30 feet from the lens. It's vertical. It's substantial in width across the shoulders in a way that immediately reads as wrong for anything on the standard species list for that region. Wrong for a bear standing to sniff the air. Which is the most common false alarm a camera trapper learns to recognize and dismiss within half a second. A bear rearing up has a particular silhouette, rounded, top-heavy in a specific way, forelimbs typically drawn in close to the body or extended for balance. What's in this frame doesn't match that silhouette. The proportions are narrower through the hips, broader through the shoulders, and the head sits atop a distinct neck rather than seeming to merge directly into the shoulder mass the way a bear's does. It's facing away from the camera. That's the detail Dana keeps coming back to when she talks about this case. Because in 6 years of camera trapping, she has never once captured an anomalous trigger, where the subject was facing directly away from the lens at the moment of first detection, and then simply held. That orientation, unmoving for the entire 11-frame sequence, roughly 20 seconds of real time. Animals investigate cameras. That's an extremely well-documented behavior in trail camera work. Curious species approach, sniff the housing, sometimes chew on it, sometimes trigger dozens of frames of nothing but a nose pressed against the lens. Animals that are alarmed by the camera flash or the faint click of the shutter typically bolt, and you get 1 or 2 frames of a blurred rear end disappearing out of frame. What you essentially never get is 11 frames, spanning 20 full seconds, of something standing with its back to the sensor, apparently doing nothing at all except standing there, facing out into the dark forest beyond the trail. By the 11th frame, it's gone. No frame shows movement, no frame shows a transition, no blur of departure. It's present in frame 10 and absent in frame 11, and the 2-second gap between those frames is not, according to everything Dana understands about animal locomotion in dense understory. Enough time for anything on 4 legs or 2 to cover the distance necessary to exit the flash radius and vanish into cover, without leaving at least a partial trailing blur in that final frame. Dana sat with those 11 frames for a long time that Thursday evening, after the other technicians had gone home, the office quiet except for the hum of the old desktop tower. She did what any trained researcher would do first. She tried to kill the anomaly with the most boring explanation available. She pulled up reference images of black bears standing bipedally, compared silhouettes, checked the shoulder-to-hip ratio, checked posture. It didn't match cleanly, but she told herself that a bear at an odd angle, partially obscured by a sapling at the frame edge, backlit strangely by infrared flash bouncing off morning dew, could produce something that read as anomalous to a tired set of eyes at the end of a long week. She logged it provisionally as Case 216, species designation unconfirmed, likely Ursus americanus atypical posture, and moved on to the next card in the stack. Because that's what the job demanded. And because 6 years of doing this job had taught her that jumping to dramatic conclusions from a handful of ambiguous frames was the fastest way to torch your credibility with colleagues who would, quite reasonably, need more than that before taking anything seriously. She might have left it there permanently, one odd card in a database of thousands of unremarkable ones, if not for what happened 4 months later in February, at a completely different site 11 miles to the northeast. Before we continue, if you've ever set up a trail camera yourself and caught something you couldn't explain, drop it in the comments. We've had cases before that started exactly that way. One confused hunter or one confused homeowner posting a blurry image online. And it turned into something much bigger once other people started coming forward. Now back to the story. Case File 241 is what Dana eventually named the February incident, and it's the one that stopped this from being a single filed-away oddity and turned it into something she started actively, quietly tracking on her own time, outside the scope of what the program officially asked her to do. The site was a river bottom, about 11 miles from Black Fork Ridge, as the crow flies. Monitored as part of a separate sub-project studying river otter recolonization along a tributary that had seen a slow return of the species after decades of absence. The kind of quiet conservation success story that rarely makes headlines, but means a great deal to the people who spend their careers on it. Camera Unit 17 was mounted low, closer to the ground than most of the program's units. Angled to catch activity along a mucky stretch of bank where otter slides had been documented the previous autumn. February in that part of Appalachia means short days, hard frost most nights, a forest gone quiet and stark. Easy conditions in some ways for camera trapping, because there's less vegetative clutter triggering false alarms from wind-blown branches. And harder in others because the batteries drain faster in the cold, and units sometimes go dark for stretches before a technician can get out to service them. Dana pulled the card from Unit 17 on a Wednesday in late February, during a routine servicing run with another technician, a younger guy on the team who we're going to call Marcus for the purposes of this story, also not his real name. Marcus was newer to the program, maybe 8 months in, sharp, enthusiastic, the kind of new hire who still gets genuinely excited about a good bobcat photo. They split up to cover more units that day, and Dana didn't review the river bottom card until that evening, back at the office, working alone again because Marcus had already left. The card had 218 triggers, heavier than usual for that time of year, mostly otters, several sequences of a pair working the same stretch of bank on consecutive nights. Exactly the kind of data the sub-project wanted. And then, near the middle of the card, a sequence time-stamped 3:02 a.m. that made Dana's stomach drop the moment the first frame loaded on screen. This time, the subject wasn't at the edge of the flash radius. It was close, maybe 15 feet from the camera, well within the zone where the infrared illuminator produced crisp, high-contrast detail rather than the grainy ambiguity of a distant trigger. And this time, it was not facing away. In the first frame of the sequence, it's already turned toward the camera, as though it had been aware of the unit's presence before the shutter ever fired, which, Dana notes, is not impossible, since camera traps do emit a faint mechanical click, and some species can clearly detect and react to that sound even if the flash itself, being infrared, should theoretically be invisible to most mammalian eyes. What the frame shows is difficult to describe in a way that doesn't sound. In Dana's own words, when she finally decided to talk about this with anyone outside her own head, completely insane. A face that reads, at first glance, as canine, elongated muzzle, visible dentition in one frame where the mouth is slightly open. but set into proportions that don't match any canid native to that ecosystem. Not coyote, not the rare transient wolf that occasionally wanders down from populations further north. And certainly not domestic dog, because the body behind that face, visible in 3 of the 7 frames in the sequence, stands upright on 2 limbs, with a body mass and shoulder width that Dana estimates, comparing against a nearby sapling of known diameter that appears in the same frame for scale. At somewhere well north of 200 pounds, distributed across a frame taller than any human that would plausibly be walking a remote river bottom alone at 3 in the morning in February. The eyes, in 2 of the frames where they catch the infrared flash directly, produce the kind of bright, reflective tapetum lucidum glow that is completely normal and expected in nocturnal mammal photography. Deer eyes do it. Raccoon eyes do it. It's simply how a reflective layer behind the retina works in low light, and under other circumstances, Dana would note it and move on without a second thought. What she can't move past, she says, is the height at which those eyes catch the light. Measured against the same reference sapling, the eye height in this sequence sits at approximately 6 feet 2 inches from the ground, which is consistent, she stresses. Not with anything crouched or on all fours, but with something standing fully upright, at a height that would put most adult humans looking slightly upward to meet its gaze. The sequence runs for 7 frames before the subject exits, and unlike the Black Fork Ridge case, this time there is a frame showing motion, a blur in frame 6 as it turns. And by frame 7, it's already gone from center frame, a fragment of dark shape still visible at the very left edge, moving with what Dana describes as considerable speed for something of that apparent mass, covering distance in the 2-second interval between frames that would represent, by her calculation, a stride and speed profile more consistent with a large canid at a run than with anything moving on 2 legs the way a human does. Dana didn't sleep much that night. She went back to the Black Fork Ridge card from October, pulled it up side by side with the February sequence, and started measuring, comparing shoulder width ratios, comparing the angle of the head relative to the spine in the frames where it was visible, comparing what little coat texture was discernible in the infrared illumination, coarse, dark, dense in a way that read more canid than urcid to her trained eye. They weren't identical images, she's careful to say. The conditions were different, the distance was different, the posture was different. But they were, in her professional assessment, consistent with each other in a way that felt significant rather than coincidental. 2 sites 11 miles apart, 4 months apart, both showing something bipedal. Both showing something with a canine-adjacent skull structure, married to a body mass and posture that belonged to nothing on the regional species list. She logged case 241 the same way she'd logged 216, cautiously, provisionally, without putting the words she was already thinking into any official document. And she started doing something she hadn't done before. She started going back through every card she'd personally pulled over the previous 3 years, looking specifically for anything she might have dismissed too quickly the first time around. Any blurred frame she'd filed under bare or unidentified and never looked at twice. She found 4 more, not 11-frame sequences, not clean, close-range captures like the River Bottom case. Fragments. A single frame from a card pulled 18 months earlier, showing what she'd originally logged as probable bear, a dark shape at extreme camera range that, re-examined now with fresh eyes and a specific hypothesis in mind, showed a hint of a tailless, upright silhouette that didn't sit quite right against her memory of typical bear posture. 2 frames from a different card, 6 months apart, from 2 different camera sites roughly 9 miles apart from each other, each showing a partial dark shape at the very edge of frame. Moving too fast and too far from the lens for confident identification, logged originally as probable deer or possible domestic dog gone feral, a not uncommon nuisance issue in that region. And 1 more, the oldest of the 4, from her very first year on the program, a single blurred frame she'd genuinely forgotten existed until she went digging, showing almost nothing usable except a suggestion of height and posture against a moonlit background that, in isolation, she would never have flagged as anything but a technical glitch or a branch swaying into frame at an unlucky moment. 6 potential incidents, spanning 4 years, spread across a monitoring area of roughly 60 square miles. Dana plotted them on a map, the old-fashioned way, pins on a printed topographic sheet she kept in her desk drawer rather than anything digital that a colleague might stumble across. What she saw when she stepped back from that map is the detail that changes the entire shape of this story, the detail that moves it from 6 strange incidents into something Dana now describes. Carefully, as a pattern worth the word she'd been avoiding. The 6 locations weren't randomly scattered across the monitoring area. They clustered, loosely but unmistakably, along a corridor roughly 2 miles wide that ran along the base of a long ridge system, following what Dana, with her ecology background, immediately recognized as a natural travel corridor, the kind of terrain feature that functions as a highway for wildlife moving through a landscape. A stretch of continuous forest cover linking several drainages, avoiding the open pasture and residential development on either side. It's exactly the kind of corridor the program's own Bobcat and Bear data had already identified as a high-use travel route for those species. Part of why cameras had been concentrated there in the first place. And it's exactly the kind of corridor that Dana began to realize with a growing unease she describes as different from fear. More like the specific dread of watching 2 separate spreadsheets start to correlate in a way you didn't expect and can't immediately explain. That also showed something else in the program's broader dataset. A concentration over that same 4-year period of coyote activity significantly denser than in comparable habitat elsewhere in the monitoring area, and more troublingly, several confirmed and multiple suspected instances of coyote predation on white-tailed deer fawns, and in 2 documented cases logged separately by a different subproject, studying local livestock depredation complaints on small livestock at farms bordering that same corridor. This is the point in the story where we have to slow down and be precise about what Dana is and isn't claiming, because it's the part of her account that surprised us most when we first heard it. And it's very different from most of the encounter testimonies you'll find on this channel. Dana isn't claiming she photographed something hunting livestock. She isn't claiming she photographed something attacking anything at all. What she's claiming, based on 4 years of camera data that she has organized, cross-referenced, and sat with for a long time before ever speaking about it to anyone, is that the unexplained bipedal sightings in her dataset cluster, geographically and to some degree temporally, around the exact same corridor where coyote-related predation pressure on both wild and domestic animals was measurably elevated compared to the rest of her study area. And that in the entire 4-year window, not one single confirmed livestock depredation complaint from any farm along that corridor was ever attributed to anything other than coyotes, and never. Not once to whatever it was her cameras had caught 6 separate times without ever quite catching it clearly. Dana's hypothesis, and she is insistent that this remains a hypothesis, something she can't prove and has never claimed to prove, formed slowly over months of turning this data over in her head. Alone, without anyone at the program to talk it through with because she wasn't ready to bring any of this to a colleague, let alone a supervisor, without more than she had. But the hypothesis, once she lets herself say it out loud, which she eventually did once in the conversation that forms the basis of this video, is this: that whatever her cameras were catching, 6 times in 6 blurred or partial frames across 4 years, wasn't hunting the deer, wasn't hunting the livestock, and, as far as 4 years of data could suggest, wasn't hunting anything belonging to the people who lived along the edges of that corridor either. That it was present in that corridor with a consistency and a frequency that suggested territorial residency rather than passing transients, the kind of pattern a resident predator establishes, not a wandering one, and that its presence, its territory, appeared to overlap almost exactly with the territory of the coyote population that was doing the actual measurable damage to deer and livestock in that stretch of forest. Dana is careful, and she wants this said clearly in this video, not to frame this as some tidy narrative where a benevolent guardian creature polices the woods on behalf of grateful farmers. She doesn't believe that, and she pushes back hard against anyone who wants to hear it that way. What she believes, cautiously, as a scientist trained to distrust her own desire for a clean story, is something colder and more mechanistic than that. that large predators establish territories. That territories exclude or suppress smaller competing predators within their bounds, a well-documented ecological phenomenon in systems with wolves and coyotes, where wolf presence measurably reduces coyote density and coyote predation pressure on deer. Simply through territorial exclusion and direct killing of coyotes that wolves treat as competitors rather than prey. That if something large, canid-adjacent, bipedal, and completely undocumented by mainstream wildlife science was maintaining a territory along that corridor. The coyote suppression she was seeing in the surrounding data might not require any intentional protection of livestock or deer at all. It might simply be the ordinary, indifferent byproduct of one predator's territorial dominance over a smaller one. The same dynamic that plays out between wolves and coyotes across thousands of documented square miles of North American wilderness, except involving a species that, as far as any official record anywhere is concerned, does not exist. That's the title of this video, and it's not something Dana said to us directly in those exact words. It's something we arrived at putting her data and her own careful hypothesis together. But she confirmed, when we read it back to her, that it captures the shape of what she came to believe more accurately than any other single sentence we tried. It doesn't hunt us, it keeps watch over the thing that does. Before we go further into what happened after Dana started actively looking for this pattern, instead of stumbling into it by accident, subscribe if you haven't. And let us know in the comments if you've ever noticed a predator absence in your own area that didn't have an obvious explanation. Coyotes that never seem to come close to a certain property line. Deer that seem to avoid a particular stretch of woods for no reason anyone can point to. Sometimes those small local mysteries turn out to be exactly the kind of thread that leads somewhere much bigger. Now, back to Dana. Once Dana had the map with 6 pins on it and a hypothesis she wasn't ready to say out loud to anyone, she made a decision that she now describes with a certain amount of professional embarrassment as reckless by the standards of good research design. But that felt, at the time, like the only way to move from suspicion to something closer to knowledge. She started deploying additional cameras on her own time, using her own personal equipment rather than program resources, specifically along the corridor she'd identified, at higher density than the official monitoring grid called for, and specifically configured to maximize the odds of a clean daylight or near-dawn capture, rather than relying on the luck of a nighttime trigger, catching something at a useful angle. This took the better part of a year. Dana describes long stretches of nothing, the ordinary tedium of camera trapping reasserting itself, hundreds of deer, dozens of coyotes. The occasional black bear moving through with cubs in tow. During the spring, she ran this unofficial side project. She kept it separate from her official program data, storing it on a personal external drive, telling herself she'd eventually find a professional way to bring it forward if it produced anything conclusive, and telling herself, less comfortably, that she genuinely didn't know what she'd do if it did. Case File 304 is the one that finally gave her something closer to conclusive, though even now, she's careful with that word. It happened in late September of the following year, almost exactly a year after the Black Fork Ridge sighting that started this whole quiet, private investigation. One of her unofficial units, mounted at a pinch point in the corridor where a narrow band of forest crossed between 2 hayfields. A spot she'd chosen specifically because game trail data suggested heavy use by multiple species funneling through that bottleneck, captured a sequence at 5:41 in the morning. Close enough to true dawn that the camera's white flash, rather than the infrared unit used at night, had triggered, producing something Dana had never had before in any of her 6 prior incidents. Color, detail, a frame that didn't require squinting and cross-referencing against a sapling for scale. The sequence shows, across 9 frames spanning roughly 25 seconds, 3 coyotes moving through the pinch point first, in the earliest frames apparently unbothered. Moving at a normal traveling pace, typical of a family group, patrolling territory in the gray light before sunrise. And then, in the 5th frame of the sequence, all 3 coyotes are visible in postures Dana immediately recognized from years of studying canid behavior as alarm postures, low, tense. One animal's head turned sharply toward the tree line to the left of frame, ears pinned. In the sixth frame, the coyotes are already in retreat, moving back the way they came, and at the very edge of the left side of the frame, something else has entered. Partially obscured by brush, but unmistakably present, dark-coated, tall enough that even in a partial frame the proportions read as substantially larger than any coyote and larger. Dana is now confident saying, than any black bear she has ever personally observed or photographed in 6 years of fieldwork in that specific ecosystem. By the seventh and eighth frames, the coyotes are gone from view entirely, and the dark shape has advanced further into frame. Close enough now that Dana was finally able to do something she had never managed with any of the previous 6 incidents. Get a genuinely clear look. Upright posture, unambiguous, weight distributed over 2 hind limbs in a stance that reads as entirely natural, rather than a momentary rearing up the way a startled bear might briefly stand. A head carried forward on a distinct neck, canine in general shape but proportioned, in Dana's careful professional assessment, in a way that simply doesn't correspond to any known extant canid. The skull too large relative to body size for coyote or wolf, the muzzle length and jaw depth suggesting something built for a bite force well beyond what those species can generate. Dense, dark fur, visibly two-toned in the improved lighting, darker along the spine and shoulders, lightening slightly toward what would be the flanks. An actual coat pattern rather than the uniform dark blur every previous sighting had offered. In the ninth and final frame of the sequence, it has turned its head directly toward the camera. Dana describes this as the single most unsettling image she has ever reviewed in her career, not because of anything aggressive in the posture. There's no bared teeth in this final frame. No lunging stance, nothing that reads as a threat display in the way that any trained observer of animal behavior would recognize a threat display. It's simply looking at the lens, directly. With what Dana, choosing her words very carefully during our conversation, describes as an awareness that unsettled her more than fear would have. Because fear she could have filed away as an ordinary human response to something large and strange in the woods, but this felt like something else. The specific unease of realizing that a wild animal has clocked the exact location of a piece of surveillance equipment and is looking straight into it the way a person looks into a camera they know. Is recording them. The card ran out of storage 2 frames later, an unrelated technical failure, an older card Dana hadn't upgraded in the excitement of the unofficial deployment. And by the time she got back out to that unit 4 days later to check on it, whatever had been in frame 9 was, of course, long gone. But she had it. 9 frames, color, close range, daylight, showing what appeared unmistakably to be a large, bipedal, canid-adjacent animal directly interposing itself in the path of a retreating coyote family group. At the exact bottleneck point in the exact corridor, where her 4 years of aggregated data suggested a resident presence, had been maintaining territory the entire time. This is where Dana's story takes the turn that explains why she asked us to protect her identity, and why. Despite having what she considers the strongest evidence she will likely ever obtain in her career, she has never submitted any of it through official channels. She brought the Case 304 sequence, first informally to her direct supervisor at the conservation nonprofit, a man with a doctorate in wildlife ecology who had been running the regional monitoring program for over a decade, and who Dana genuinely respected, describing him during our conversation as a careful, rigorous scientist who she trusted to give her an honest assessment rather than simply dismissing her out of hand. She showed him the 9 frames without initially mentioning the 5 prior incidents, wanting his unbiased reaction to the strongest single piece of evidence first. He looked at it for a long time, she says, longer than she expected. He asked technical questions about camera settings, about the possibility of a costume or a hoax, about whether the file metadata had been checked for signs of tampering, which Dana had already done, finding nothing anomalous in the timestamps or file structure. He asked whether it could be a very large domestic dog, perhaps an unusually built breed, or a dog with some abnormal growth condition, standing at an odd angle that exaggerated its apparent bipedalism, a possibility Dana had also already considered, and in her professional judgment. Ruled out based on the proportions visible in the clearest frames, proportions that simply did not correspond to any canine skeletal structure she was aware of, domestic or wild. In the end, her supervisor didn't call her a liar, and he didn't call her crazy, not in those words. What he did, according to Dana, was something more subtle and, in its own way, more discouraging. He told her that the image was genuinely strange, that he didn't have an immediate confident explanation for it, and that this was exactly the kind of ambiguous, single-source evidence that the program could not responsibly do anything with. He explained, with what Dana describes as real patience and no hostility at all, that submitting this kind of material into any official database or publication would invite exactly the wrong kind of attention, that it would very likely end the program's credibility with its funding partners, that state wildlife agencies and university grant committees do not respond well to camera trap programs that start generating cryptid photographs, however carefully documented, and that the responsible course of action, in his professional opinion, was to file it as an unidentified anomaly, keep it out of any published or shared reporting, and move on. Dana understood the logic. She still understands it. She told us, even now, even having decided to finally speak about this publicly, in a heavily anonymized way, years after the fact. She doesn't think her supervisor acted in bad faith. She thinks he made exactly the calculation that institutional science is built to make, a calculation that protects the credibility and the funding and the long-term viability of legitimate, valuable conservation work by refusing to engage with anything that can't be cleanly, defensibly explained. But she also describes, in the months that followed that conversation, a growing sense of isolation within her own team, not overt, nothing anyone said directly, but a subtle recalibration in how her supervisor assigned her fieldwork, a slight increase in office and data processing duties relative to solo backcountry deployments. Nothing dramatic enough to complain about formally, but enough that Dana, reading between the lines the way anyone does when they suspect their judgment is quietly being reassessed, understood the message clearly enough without it ever being spoken aloud. She left the program 18 months later, for reasons she describes as genuinely mixed, partly the ordinary career progression of someone in her field looking for the next opportunity, partly, she admits now, a slow-building discomfort with staying in a role where she felt she couldn't be fully honest with her own colleagues about what she believed she had documented on their own equipment, in their own study area, over 4 years of her own careful work. Before we get to what Dana thinks now, years later, looking back on all of it, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. And if you work in any field where you spend real time in remote backcountry, wildlife biology, forestry, search and rescue, hunting, guiding, let us know in the comments if any of this resonates with patterns you've noticed yourself. We hear from people in those professions more often than you'd think, and most of them, like Dana, have never told anyone outside a very small circle. Now let's finish this story. There's one more piece of testimony Dana shared with us that she considers, in some ways, more significant than the 9 frames of Case 304. Even though it produced no photographic evidence at all. It happened the following spring, several months after her conversation with her supervisor, during what would turn out to be one of her last solo fieldwork days before she left the program. She was hiking out to service 2 of the unofficial cameras she still maintained privately, early on a Saturday morning, alone. Along a stretch of the corridor, she now knew better than almost any other technician working in that region. She describes the morning as unremarkable at first. Cool, foggy in the low ground the way spring mornings often are in that terrain, birdsong picking up as the light came on. Nothing to suggest the day would be any different from dozens of other solo servicing trips she'd made along that same stretch. About 40 minutes into the hike, following a game trail that ran roughly parallel to a small stream at the bottom of a shallow draw, Dana became aware, gradually rather than suddenly, of a change in the ambient sound of the forest around her. The birdsong that had been building steadily since dawn simply stopped, not all at once in a way that would suggest a single startling event, but over the course of what she estimates was 2 or 3 minutes, a slow tapering into a silence that she describes Using language she's careful to note comes from her scientific training, rather than any inclination toward the dramatic. As consistent with the documented phenomenon of birds and small mammals going quiet in response to the movement of a large, potentially dangerous predator through an area. A well-established ecological signal that field researchers are trained to notice and respect. She stopped walking. She stood still for a period she estimates at close to 10 minutes, doing nothing more dramatic than listening, scanning the tree line on either side of the draw, feeling, she says, not panic exactly, but a heightened, focused awareness that 6 years of solo backcountry fieldwork had trained into her as an appropriate response to that specific kind of silence, the kind that means something, as opposed to the ordinary quiet of an empty morning. She never saw anything. That's important to her account, and she's insistent about it, unwilling to embellish the story with a sighting that didn't happen just because it would make for a cleaner narrative. What she experienced instead, standing in that silent draw, was something she can only describe as a strong, specific, and entirely subjective sense of being positioned between two things, neither of which she could see, one somewhere in the brush to her left, one somewhere further up the draw ahead of her, and a feeling, impossible to substantiate with any data, and she doesn't try to, that whatever was to her left was not oriented toward her at all, but past her, toward whatever was further up the draw. After roughly 10 minutes, the birdsong resumed, first tentatively, a single call, then building back to its normal density over another few minutes. The way Dana describes forest soundscapes typically recovering after a large predator has moved through and away from an area. She finished her hike to the camera units, serviced them without incident, and hiked back out by a different route than she'd come in on. A decision she made in the moment without fully articulating to herself why, though she's honest now in retrospect, that it was simply because she did not want to walk back through that same stretch of draw again that morning. When she reviewed the footage from the nearest camera unit later that week, the one closest to that draw, she found nothing during the relevant window. No trigger at all during the approximately 20-minute period surrounding her experience, which she notes is not actually surprising, since the unit's detection zone covered only a narrow cone of the draw, and whatever had been present, if anything had been present at all beyond her own subjective impression, could easily have been outside that zone the entire time. She includes this incident in her account, she told us, specifically because it produced no evidence whatsoever and because she thinks that absence matters. 6 documented visual incidents over 4 years, spread across a specific corridor, correlating with suppressed coyote-related predation pressure in the surrounding data. And then this 7th incident, purely experiential, unphotographed, that nonetheless fits, in its structure, the same pattern the other 6 suggested. Something present, something oriented outward away from her toward something else in the landscape that wasn't her. Something that, as far as 4 years of camera data and one morning of unexplained silence in a forest draw can suggest, was never actually hunting Dana at all, and was never, as far as she has ever been able to determine, hunting anyone else's livestock or interest either. Watching something else, keeping something else in check, for reasons that belong entirely to whatever ecological logic governs its own existence, not to any relationship with the human beings who occasionally wandered, with their cameras and their careful notebooks, into the edges of its territory. Dana left the conservation program the following autumn and moved into a different sector of environmental consulting work, a career shift she describes as satisfying in most ways, though she admits, quietly near the end of our conversation, that she still keeps that external hard drive, the one with her unofficial data on it, in a drawer in her current apartment. That she has never deleted it and doesn't intend to, and that every so often, usually late at night, she pulls up case file 304 again, those 9 frames, and looks at the 9th one. The one where it's looking directly back at the lens, and tries, still, 4 years after leaving the program and much longer after that first ambiguous card from Black Fork Ridge, to decide what exactly she believes she caught looking back at her. She doesn't have a clean answer, and she was clear with us that she doesn't want this video to present one. She's not interested in being part of a narrative where an unknown creature is romanticized as a benevolent forest guardian. a framing she finds almost as scientifically irresponsible as outright dismissal, because it replaces one unearned certainty with another. What she has, she says, is 4 years of camera data, 6 visual incidents, 1 strong experiential incident. A geographic and behavioral pattern that a decade of ecological training tells her is statistically meaningful rather than coincidental, and a hypothesis she is willing to state plainly once. On the record in this video, precisely because she has left the field where stating it publicly would have cost her a career she still cared about. The hypothesis is this: that somewhere in that corridor of Appalachian forest, something exists that mainstream wildlife science has never documented, something large, bipedal, canid in general morphology, but distinct from any recognized species, that maintains a stable territory with enough consistency to leave a 4-year trace in careful camera trap data, if you know exactly where and how to look for it. That its presence in that territory appears to correlate with meaningfully suppressed predation pressure from a smaller, well-documented predator species within the same range, in a pattern ecologically consistent with the well-established dynamic of large predator territorial exclusion, suppressing smaller competitors. The same dynamic documented for decades between wolves and coyotes across other parts of North America. And that if this hypothesis holds, the animal's relationship to the humans and the livestock, and the deer sharing that landscape with it may be, in the most literal and least mystical sense possible, almost entirely incidental, a side effect of one predator asserting territorial dominance over another, rather than any intentional guardianship extended toward the farms and the families living along the edges of its range. It doesn't hunt us, it keeps watch over the thing that does. Not because it has chosen to protect us, Dana wants to be clear, but simply because, in whatever ecological role it occupies in that stretch of forest, keeping that other predator suppressed is what it does, the same way a wolf pack suppresses coyotes without any awareness of or interest in the deer herds and cattle pastures that happen to benefit downstream from that suppression. It is not a guardian. It is not indifferent to us either, not entirely, not if the 9 frames of case 304 mean anything at all. Not if something that large and that aware can look directly into a camera lens without any trace of alarm. But whatever understanding it has of the humans moving through its territory, Dana believes, based on everything 4 years of data can suggest to her, is not built around us at all. We are at most incidental to a much older and much colder arrangement that has nothing to do with why we're safe, and everything to do with a territory, a boundary, and a smaller predator that has learned, the way prey species learn, exactly how far it can push before something larger decides it's pushed too far. Dana still has the hard drive. She still on certain nights opens case 304 and looks at frame 9. And she still, 4 years after leaving the program, and much longer after that very first card, came back from Black Fork Ridge full of raccoons, and one impossible 11-frame sequence at 2:19 in the morning. Has not decided whether what looked back at her camera that dawn in September was aware of her specifically, or was simply looking, the way any territorial animal looks, at the newest and least understood thing that had entered its range. She thinks now that it might not matter which one is true. Either way, she says, it was there the whole time, watching something we couldn't see, for reasons that belonged entirely to itself. If this story reached you the way it reached us when Dana first agreed to share her data, let us know in the comments which part stayed with you the most, the 11 frames at Black Fork Ridge, the close encounter at the river bottom, or the silent draw where she saw nothing at all but knew, with total certainty, that she wasn't alone. Subscribe if you haven't, turn on notifications so you don't miss the next testimony, and we'll see you in the next video, because if Dana's data means anything, there's a lot more standing quietly at the edge of the frame than any of us have ever managed to catch clearly.